We'd like to welcome our the rest of our panel, who are going to be looking with us. These are nonprofit newspapers that news organizations that are really at the forefront of understanding these kinds of stakeholder relationships. So they're going to be talking about the power of their community engagement, what they've been doing differently, how they seek to really make sure that they're authentically engaging in a relationship with their stakeholders. And I'd like to start with Bettina Chang, who's the co-founder of City Bureau. Bettina, thank you, and please let us know what you've been up to. Thanks.
Hi, thanks so much, Fraser, and thank you everybody for giving me an opportunity to wear earrings for the first time in 3 months. It is so good to see so many of your faces. Normally I'd be seeing you on the conference circuit in person, but you know, now I guess we get to see each other's homes and dogs and children instead. I am, for those of you who don't know me, I am with City Bureau, which is a civic journalism lab based in Chicago. And sorry, I just want to make sure I'm on the right topic here. So we're talking about what we've been doing recently with the unrest that's happening, or is this about the sort of
I think
like
about your
nonprofit board?
stakeholder engagement and the metrics that you're using with your board in particular.
Okay, great. Yeah. So you know, for those of you who don't know, City Bureau was co-founded in 2015, in fact, specifically to address the issues that people are talking about today. Among them, racial injustice, specifically policing. In 2015, there was a pretty big uprising and protest movement after the killing of Laquan McDonald, a 17-year-old who was carrying a knife but walking away from police at that time. One of the reasons that City Bureau was started was because we knew that the news coverage, traditional news coverage, tends to focus on institutional points of view. And we had really strong police union that really drives the narrative around police killings here. And so we created City Bureau as a way to be able to really center the experiences of people who face police violence every day. So mostly Black and brown folks from neighborhoods in Chicago that we cover on the South and West sides. And we designed our entire editorial process to put their feedback at the center, to make sure that the lived experiences that they have really drove our editorial process. So that means not only were we coming up with story ideas in community, in conversation with folks, but also that we were training people from neighborhoods that were affected, that we were asking people every step along the way of the editorial process. Do we talk to the right person? Is this focused right? Are we distributing this information the way that you want it? Because a lot of times people don't necessarily want, you know, an awesome 1,200 word story that we're so fond of. So in terms of stakeholder engagement, you know, we really took that process and we expanded it to every aspect of our organization. So when we started, we were mostly just training traditional journalists. Nowadays, City Bureau has 3 full programs. The first one is still this fellowship training program that we still run. The second one is something called the public newsroom, where we open up, well, we used to open up our actual physical newsroom space, you know, on hiatus for now, but we're doing it digitally, to invite people in to debate, discuss issues in the news, and specifically, how are they covered? Because there's really, really great media critique out there if you're willing to listen, and sort of co-creating solutions together at these workshops. And then our third program, the Documenters program, was created to find different points of access for people to be part of the journalism process. So documenters.org is where you can find all of the public meetings that are happening in Chicago and Cook County, now also Wayne County in Detroit and Cuyahoga County in Cleveland. So that people can sign up, get a free training, and then they're paid to cover these meetings. So we're really bringing people into the process there. And so in terms of stakeholder engagement, you know, it's a really tough question for us, but a question that we love to answer because, you know, the idea of who is a stakeholder when your topic is something like racial justice or like what is happening in your community and how do you have a hand in shaping it is pretty much everyone. And you can't just, you know, expect people to read your stories or come to your events. You have to go out there. You have to really push yourself to do something that's different, make yourself vulnerable, and be open to hear what people say. So yeah, I appreciate Christine for sharing that URL in the chat because The next thing that I think our whole panel is really interested in talking about is that when you're a nonprofit, is it just a tax status is often a question, right? And it could be, or you could really use the format and the structures of a nonprofit to ensure that you are aligning the business incentives with the actual impact that you want to have as a news organization. So you can tell your board of directors, like, we're not counting page views. That's not what matters to us. We want to be measured in terms of success by the number of relationships that we build in our community. And that's something that you're able to do when you're a nonprofit. That is a lot harder to do when you're dealing with market incentives.
Thank you, Bettina. That's absolutely what we were hoping you'd say. And we have got the metrics on the chat. Is there anything you want to say to people about what they see when they see those metrics? And then we'll turn to Mark to talk about impact.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess the first thing that I would say is, choose a board that understands that you can measure journalism metrics in a way that isn't just the basics that you see when you Google it, right? That like none of us really as journalists want to be measured. No one wants their work valued by number of page views or number of Instagram shares. There are other ways to measure that impact. And if you look at this blog that has been posted in the chat, you'll see that we've actually come up with 12 program outcomes. They fall into 4 big buckets. One of them is about civic knowledge. One of them is about skills. There's something about sort of information resilience in the ecosystem. And let me see, I'm gonna mess this up if I don't look at it. And then the last one is about those generative relationships that I mentioned. So, having looked into some of the research behind these items, we found that if you have skills, relationships, and the knowledge to be able to put, your to sort of think about civic engagement in your community, that you actually create a more resilient information system that can bounce back from when something like COVID-19 happens, for instance, right? That people maybe aren't looking for like the TikTok of city government, but rather, how do I apply for unemployment? Where do I find food, the nearest food pantry? These are really, really huge questions in a very underserved sector of our community, which is folks who aren't regular news consumers, but information is critical to them. And so when we measure our effectiveness based on these 4 buckets, we can go to our board and say, like, look at how successful we were with these things. And we can also message really well to our donors, our individual donors and our foundation partners to say, like, this is how we define success. This is what we did. So this is why we are, we've become an integral part of the community and worth supporting.
Thank you, Bettina. That's very helpful. And thank you for sharing that. Mark Rochester with Type Investigations, you've talked earlier with me about the role of impact and how you view the news that way. Can you share a little bit there? And I think you need to be unmuted, sorry. Mark, I'm not hearing you. I apologize. Is anyone else having trouble? Why don't we, if it's helpful, Mark, we can move to Giles and then come back. Is that okay with you? Let's move. Giles, thank you. Giles, you've really had to make a pivot in your organization to a community model. Can you share how that happened and what you've learned in your journey?
Sure. I'll try and I'll go as quick as I can. First of all, I want to say I saw Daryl Holliday at ONA last year, and what Bettina and Daryl are doing at City Bureau is really inspiring to us, and I think to a lot of newsrooms like mine around the country. Look, I came in 2018 to take over a nonprofit that was started in 2005, and I think I came in to an organization that was essentially, I could be more compassionate about telling this story, but I need to be quick. It was essentially a privileged information resource for the privileged information class in Charlottesville. And it was also a support system for the daily paper of record. So we raised money from the community to create free content for the daily paper of record. And we essentially covered, public meetings, public records, public functions. I came in 2018. In 2017, Charlottesville was at the center of the Unite the Right rallies came to town and placed us at the center of a race and equity conversation nationally. But I think what people nationally maybe don't understand is how intense and quick that conversation turned into a local conversation about equity and that. So, as a news leader coming in with a 6-month absence to a small organization that was in good standing, as an INN member, as a Lion member, I had to quickly make a decision about what we were going to be and how we could serve the public. I think we all understood that it couldn't be business as usual and that it had to be really decisive. And so with the help of Fran Scarlett, we changed our mission right away with the board. And we really began the pivot of becoming a public service newsroom that serves the entire community. The minute you do that as a nonprofit, it opens up this rabbit hole. It's like what Martin was saying this morning. You have to have the answer of why in nonprofit. Why are you doing this? Then you have to have the answer. What is the value you're providing the people? Then you have to ask yourself all these questions. Who are the people you're serving? Does your board reflect that? Does your staff reflect that? So we went through these changes, okay? And it's been 2 years now. Let me give you some good news. 35% total revenue growth, 100% reader revenue growth, 60% year-over-year audience growth, okay? So it's like you can do well by doing right. But for me, as a young white male of privilege, child of 2 journalists in DC, there's a higher responsibility if I'm going to lead this organization, which is you got to be braver. You got to get stuck in. You got to do things with the understanding that you should be able to take risks that people will want you replaced, and you should be able to hand that off to the next person. But the main thing you need to do is, if you're thinking about audience growth and diversification, you have to grow your audience and diversify it. And you have to immediately, once you set the stake in the ground with your mission and you get your board aligned, you have to decide what metrics of success are, like Bettina was saying. And for us, it was about audience. Now, it's a long and windy road, and it was not easy. It has not been easy. But we find ourselves in this position now of relative strength. And I think for me, the 3 pieces of advice I give to locals of our size who are trying to navigate some of these changes, diversify your newsroom first, get diverse leadership in your newsroom. Get into a coaching format, like a change management format, like table stakes. It has been invaluable to us. I mean, shout out to all those coaches, especially Lizzie and Fran for us, but Tim, Ryan, everybody. And then focus on the table stakes, target audiences, targeted content for target audiences, and measure it. Focus on partnerships and extending your capacity and building trust. We knew that the biggest challenge for us was going to be building trust with African-American reading audiences around our city. We are not there yet, but we had, I think we've made major progress. And so this month we launched something I'm very proud of. It's a partnership with Vinegar Hill Magazine, which is a Black publishing company in Charlottesville, named after the neighborhood that was erased during urban renewal. And Sarad and Eddie backed this partnership. We funded it together. The Facebook Journalism Project funded it. And it looks at the impact of COVID and the shutdown on the African-American community in Charlottesville through the lens of the social determinants of health, which is a long-term framework for understanding all the structural racism and inequity that happens in towns like this. So, Charlottesville thought of itself 5 years ago in its white community as Happy Town, USA, College Town, DC, Richmond bedroom community, but it's plantation town, it's Jim Crow town, it's massive resistance town, it's segregated town, it's got the highest income disparities and education achievement disparities in the nation. So look, activists have forced the issue in Charlottesville 2 years ago and taken over the government. But now we're trying to figure out how community works through change. How does that happen? And it's not that easy. And so what we're saying is we're going to be a public service newsroom that centers ourselves there with that problem, with that value. And we're also going to build power and revenue out of that place.
Thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. And one of the comments is so much to think about. Thanks for providing all this food for thought. And we'll be taking, hopefully we'll have time for some questions. So if people want to pop those into the chat. Robert, let's turn to you in Madison. I know that something that's been really important for you is how you appeal to the audience differently as you pivoted in your nonprofit newsroom.
Yeah, hello. The pivot, we didn't really make a pivot. We started 5 years ago as a nonprofit, specifically focused on communities of color in Madison. Madison is a pretty media-rich town, so the gap in media was related to communities of color, and so we stepped into that gap, and we just we spent about a summer, about 3 months, just kind of meeting once a week to kind of lay groundwork for this new organization, and at one point we had to decide, like, how are we going to structure this, and it was clear that even then, this is 2015, even then the for-profit news business was not the smartest thing to jump into right then. Not only that, but as focusing on communities of color, which are not exactly plentiful in Wisconsin. So we're already in a smallish city that has a lot of other media competition. We're further limiting our own audience. So that's why we decided to go nonprofit. But what that did for us, from a revenue standpoint at the beginning and even now, is that we're appealing to a different set of values for our corporate clients or our corporate partners, right? We don't go to the ad buyer necessarily. We go to the corporate outreach people, to the philanthropy people, to the engagement people. We have some corporate entities here in town who are really focused on equity, and were focused on equity in 2015.
Sorry. That's just me, sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. But so we were able to appeal to that different. We're not appealing to number of eyeballs or CPM. We're not telling you the size of the audience necessarily, as much as the quality of the audience and the quality of the engagement of our audience. So we have spent 5 years building a brand, and maybe I can talk a little bit more about some advice to build a strong nonprofit news brand. But we've spent this 5 years building that brand, and now corporations want to be associated with our brand. So what we have is this membership program now that basically a corporation, we don't have a reader membership program, we have a corporate membership program. So these local business entities and large corporations just basically buy a membership, and the ads they get as the sort of the member benefits are actually valued less than what they pay us for the membership. So what they're paying us for, what they're donating for, what they're giving us money for, is the association with the brand, and just that they can then be associated with us, be seen as supporting communities of color, be seen as supporting local independent journalism, more than just getting the clicks through to on their ads. You know what I mean? But in terms of audience engagement, obviously social media is a big thing. But we have also, one of the things we've learned from this COVID time is that people love this virtual meeting stuff. It's weird. I wouldn't have expected that, but they really do. And we've had now, earlier, Sue, give the example of that one we did with the police. That was the second one we did. We did a whole day long thing a week ago Friday. We have another whole day long thing coming up tomorrow with Black youth. And we're just doing them on Zoom, streaming them live on Facebook. We put them on YouTube afterwards, and our reporters will then just write a recap and summary. That's the most engagement we have at any specific time. And that's something that we're uniquely positioned to do as a nonprofit, because we don't need to have it sponsored or anything, right? We have Facebook Journalism Project grant money to do that. We have other sort of corporate grant money, local grant money to do that. And so we don't need to sell ads in it. We can do it purely as an engagement tool to get people talking. And it's not necessarily journalism, strictly. it's not reporting, but it's starting conversations. It's getting people active, getting people engaged in issues in a way that that hasn't happened before. So I hope that is useful.
Mark, Robert, thank you so much.
Yeah.
How would you give me a couple words that would describe your brand when you go to have those conversations with your corporate supporters? What do you say your brand is, and what is the value add to them?
Our brand is that we're very trustworthy, as you all know, as has been discussed this whole day. People of color, generally speaking, don't trust media, mainstream media, and we found that our people don't even, our core audience doesn't even really read other media, mainstream local media especially. So our brand is that these are people who, that when you're engaging with us, you're engaging with an audience that trusts us, and that we are their main source of news, and we are community engaged, where we consider ourselves community journalists, meaning we are members of the community. We have a stake in the community. We're still professional. We still follow all the ethics and everything, but we have skin in this game, and that's what you get from us that you don't get from the daily newspaper.
Thank you, Robert. And I want to remind folks we're leaving time for folks to answer your questions. So please feel free to throw them in the chat. Mark, let's turn to you now. We'd love to hear about what's happening with type investigations, and in particular, how you've turned to a real focus on impact and how you share that impact with the community.
Hi, can you hear me now?
We can, yay, good job.
Okay. Okay.
But speak loudly, Mark.
Oh, yeah.
It's fairly faint. So maybe
stay.
you can edge closer to your microphone.
I'm calling in using phone audio. I'll put the phone as close to me as I can. Is that better?
A little bit, but work at it.
Okay, I'll try and speak more loudly. So I've been doing type investigations for a couple of months. I spent a couple of decades in traditional newspaper investigative reporting, most recently at the Detroit Free Press. But even though I'm sort of new to the nonprofit game, I think the lessons are still very much on point with what we're trying to do in type investigations. We're trying to take the impact of our investigative reporting and make it very clear to both readers, subscribers to our newsletters, to supporters, as well as various stakeholders, public officials and others who happen to read our work, that we're not just executing high impact investigative reporting, we're making it clear what the results of that reporting are. In other words, we're out there creating real concrete change out in the community, and we're letting readers know about that impact. It's very important. It's very important.
Yay!
That's better.
That's much better.
Okay. It's very important to not just do good journalism. It's important to show readers, subscribers, donors the impact of that work. We were very good at the Detroit Free Press. We've devoted significant resources into producing very high quality community impact reports. We report teams of journalists that producing these reports. We had designers, we had web designers. We produced a glossy magazine that was all about the impact of both our actual journalism as well as community-based efforts that made a difference in the community. For example, we would do Freedom of Information Act training sessions for ordinary people out in the community. So if you were part of a block group and you were trying to get records from the city of Detroit about whatever, a housing project in your neighborhood, whether your streets got potholes filled, whatever your issue was, we would help train ordinary people on how to file FOIA requests with different agencies in the city and in the state. And so we communicated that effort along with the rest of the journalism we were highlighting for readers in this glossy magazine, and we distributed it out in the community, we made it available online. We disseminated that impact report very widely because we wanted to send out the message very clearly. Look, we don't just talk about doing impactful reporting that changes our community. We are spending time highlighting what it was, why it was important, what changed, and how you can look forward to seeing more of this kind of reporting in the Detroit Free Press. We're doing the same thing at Type Investigations. It's just disseminated a little differently because we're a national investigative newsroom, and that's all we do. But the idea that the communicating that to readers is just crucial to being a successful nonprofit, especially, but also a successful traditional newspaper. It's not enough just to do the work. You've got to send strong messages that work makes a difference. And it doesn't matter whether you're an investigative newsroom or whether you're more broadly a general news kind of organization. One of the best stories we did at the Free Press that actually had a real world impact that meant something was a story we did about, it was basically about the city. Detroit is a very aggressive tax foreclosure city. If you're a few $100s behind on your property taxes, you can get your home taken away from you. We did a story about that. It wasn't a big investigation. It was simply sort of a personal story about someone who lost their home. After that story ran, the city contacted us and said, you know what, that guy's getting his house back. We agree that shouldn't have happened, and it's such a painful story. We want to do everything we can to get that person their house back. That wasn't an impact that affected thousands of people, but for that family, that made all the difference in the world. And so we wanted to make sure that our readers saw that story, that here's journalism that resulted in a very personal impact for one family, but it meant everything to them. And so that's the power that doing these kind of impact reports can have. I don't have time to give lots of examples of effective ways to do that, but I believe INN is going to share a link in the chat that you can download some very good examples that we did in Detroit. I'm sorry, not just in Detroit, but it's an article about how important impact reporting is. There's also a very good video that was done with Better News that basically explains again the importance of impact reporting and impact tracking, and how you can approach doing this kind of reporting for your own news organization. If it's not in the chat yet, it's a very simple. It's a bit.ly link. It's mark_AT_INN. If you have trouble finding it, you can email me at mark@typeinvestigations.org.
We have it
at that point, I think I'll turn it over.
Mark, I've got a quick question for you. We heard from Bettina about the importance of having the right people around the table when you set the intention of the organization around impact, and around the metrics that you use. Who was part of the discussion about what you would be measuring around impact? Who helped that decision get made?
Great question. Sorry.
I'm sorry, Bettina. I was asking Mark that question. Sorry.
Sorry, Mark. Go ahead. My bad.
That's okay. That's okay. So I've only been with Type Investigations for 2 months. So that was not actually, those actually haven't been decisions I've been a part of yet. But I can basically tell you, we have a CEO and executive director who's very in tune to the work that we do. We're part of a portfolio of programs under Type Media Center. And the CEO and the board communicates often. They share our vision for doing high impact work, and communicating that to not just our funders, but our entire sort of supportive network, the reporters who work with us, people just generally supportive of the kind of investigative reporting we do. But the board and TAE are very attuned to making sure that we are known for the work that we're doing and recognized for. We do a lot of our work in partnership And so they're very supportive of the idea that we need, high visibility as part of the work that we do in that regard.
Thank you, Mark. The last person we'll be hearing from before Q&A is John Bebo, who's with the Center for Michigan Bridge Magazine. John, thank you for joining us.
I'm thrilled to be here, and a shout out to Mark Rochester. Type investigations gain is certainly Michigan's loss. You were a great leader in this state, and I'm grateful for it. So it's good to see you here today, Mark. In terms of nonprofit news differentiation and the public trust, we openly invite and demand to be held accountable to local communities. And we differentiate by pointing out that we are not accountable to shareholders or Wall Street or owners or stock price. And I think that's a fundamental difference and a fundamental reason the nonprofit movement has grown so much over the past decade. The old way simply isn't working nearly well enough anymore. In terms of measuring that through a business lens, I think as Giles mentioned, readership and membership and readership loyalty are really key ways to put some numbers on things like public trust. That can be kind of a hazy concept, but are you relevant? Are you being relevant to your marketplace? Are you attracting diverse readership? We've put everything we have at Bridge with our team of about a dozen journalists into covering the pandemic like everybody else. They've worked 7 days a week for months on end. And the results have been incredible. The reasons behind them, tragic, but the results have been incredible. We've seen 800% growth in readership this year. We've seen 1,200% growth in readership loyalty in terms of readers who are reading us 5 times or more per month. And we've seen 300% growth.
John, I think you've frozen up.
Did I catch up? Can you hear me?
You're fine.
And we've seen 300% growth in membership this year, in part because we carefully watch Google Analytics and Google Trends and what people have wanted from us in Michigan coverage. We've published nearly 400 reports on the pandemic crisis across the state. And from the stream of donations that are coming in every day, the anecdotes are clear. People are really depending on nonprofit news and Bridge to provide public service news in this crucial moment of this incredible year. In terms of addressing civil rights and justice and equity issues, if you're a journalist in Michigan, this is not new, and it didn't begin on Memorial Day. It's a constant consideration in civic newsrooms all across our state. We've worked to address equity, to address COVID coverage through an equity lens. Less than 2 weeks into the pandemic crisis in Michigan, Bridge was able to work with our colleagues at Outlier Media in Detroit to document for the first time the dramatic, massive caseload impacts on minority communities in Detroit and across the state. We're also able to advocate for the state releasing very clear details on cases by race and age, because the initial reporting that was being released by our government was not very transparent. We've done the same in nursing homes. So it's stories like that we're trying to constantly look at all coverage through an equity lens. The protests and the injustices of recent weeks coincided with an effort that we've worked on here for 2 years to fundraise for and launch a new local edition called Bridge Detroit, which launched on May 15th. It is an editorially independent local edition, staffed entirely by journalists of color. 6 extremely talented journalists of color lead Bridge Detroit, and we're immediately able to I think, cover the protests and the unrest and the injustice from a completely different perspective, a different tone, a very much community-rooted tone. One of the first stories Bridge Detroit produced after protests in Detroit really got at the nature through the voices of Detroiters of what the protest was about. And it wasn't only about police brutality. It was about a legacy in Michigan of inequity in education, and about the extreme impacts of the pandemic on minority communities, and a number of other issues that go back decades. So it's really important to think about civil rights issues and equity coverage in terms of your own staffing. It's a challenge across our entire industry, and it's work that's never done. But I'm extremely proud of my colleagues at Bridge Detroit for how they've immediately jumped in and done some really incredible work right off the bat. And I think it really matters that that is a newsroom that is truly representative of the community it's covering. We've also added, we've had great opportunity to add 3 journalists of color to our statewide team this summer, 3 interns, all Michigan natives who are students at Yale, Columbia, and the University of Michigan. They're covering Native American communities and doing data reporting from an equity lens. And that brings in a new generation of journalists. Bridge started 9 years ago hiring veteran reporters. That doesn't, that helps with a lot of things, but it doesn't help reach new generations of readers and be relevant to the new generations of readers and citizens in our country. Finally, in Bridge's statewide coverage here in recent weeks, we're constantly trying to take a data-driven approach to covering issues. And so in the days after Memorial Day, we were able to look at and document how Michigan police departments are entirely too white for the diverse communities they're covering. And we continue to use data sets and in-depth reporting to really get to the how and the why of some of these issues. I want to come back to something Giles said in conclusion here. He talked about higher responsibility. And I think part of our higher responsibility here is not only the journalism, but it is the business. It is, the journalism is fleeting and won't matter if we can't sustain and grow the businesses of our operations. And we talk about this every year at INN Days, but you've got to have people who are focused on growing and diversifying revenues. It's every bit as important as journalism, because without the money, you can't do the public work.
John, thank you. And one thing, I'm from the nonprofit world, not the journalism world, but one thing I tell our journalists, and I know Jennifer Napier-Pierce does as well, is without that really good journalism, no one will buy, no one will donate, no one will come to our events. So the two really go hand in hand. I think that it's our responsibility to ensure the long-term sustainability of this critical voices in our communities. And so thanks to our panelists for sharing the various ways that they're measuring their impact, the way that they're responsive to their communities. And I think an important point I took away was the continued need to be relevant and to make sure that as issues come forward, as we're seeing in our nation right now, that we're able to respond to them authentically and immediately because of the trust that we've built. We did have a couple questions, and unfortunately at one point I got bumped off of this whole thing, so I've lost my historic chat. But someone else is going to ask one question that came in.
Hey, Fraser, it's Sue. I can read it. We had a question from Janice Coate to Mark. Mark, this is actually 2 questions. Do you advertise or essentially reach out to the citizens actively to have them tell you their experiences and suggest those for your newsroom to investigate? And then secondly, do you engage with perpetrators in order to give them a chance to rethink, react to a different outcome?
Sure. So being a national nonprofit.
Hey, Mark, I'm afraid it's a little faint. If you could try again, whatever magic you worked before to get your voice a little louder, that'd be great.
Okay.
Sorry about the technical
One
difficulty.
second. How about now?
Opposite direction.
Not really. Hey, Mark, why don't we come back to you in a minute? Another question for Robert was on the branding. You talked about branding as the influence, the people that Madison 365 reaches, but you had also mentioned how you approach branding as a nonprofit. Was there a specific nonprofit angle to it?
Yeah, it's not really an angle, but it's more of a method. The manner in which we built our brand was by partnering with other local nonprofits, as well as sort of like public benefit companies and organizations, and basically offering media services to nonprofits on events and things. For example, we became the media sponsor of the Madison Area Music Awards. And as such, we basically did some custom content for them, some advertising in exchange. We get the media sponsorship, we get the logo on their thing and on all the materials. We did the same for the Hip Hop Awards. We did the same for like Juneteenth for our first 3 years. All the Juneteenth celebrations we were the media sponsor of the Juneteenth celebrations. We don't have to do those as much anymore, but we're constantly doing media partnerships and media sponsorships of local community events and local nonprofit organizations for our first probably 2 or 3 years. And because those organizations already had a strong brand in the community, not just in the community broadly, but in the communities we were trying to reach, that basically ends up being that organization co-signing us as a trusted source of information and news. And that was kind of our primary strategy / tactic for building that brand and getting our brand awareness among the audience, the specific audience what we were after. Does that make sense?
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank each of our panelists for participating today. So if we can give them a silent round of applause. Thank you very, very much. We've got a lot of the resources that we talked about in the chat line, and I'm sure they'll be made available to us following this meeting as well. Thank you to Sue and to INN for coordinating our activities, and thanks to each of our panelists.
Thank you, Fraser, and thank you for the whole panel. Really appreciated the comments and the shared vision of what you're doing as nonprofits there.